Welcome to Reformed Thinking. You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of, well, precision.
Right, like a very clear-cut binary situation.
Yeah, it feels like engineering or something. You fall off a bike, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right across the radius bone.
And the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is. There is the problem.
Spot on. And that is comforting, I think. We like things to be visible. We like them to be categorized, put in a neat little box so we can figure out the treatment plan.
Sure, we want a straightforward fix.
But then you step into the world of global conflicts, geopolitics, and theology, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
It really is. We are trying to understand the root causes of international crises, and the landscape is just a tangled mess of treaties, history, and human ambition.
You are not just looking at a broken bone anymore. You are looking at centuries of history, economic survival instincts, and spiritual realities, all just crashing into each other at the exact same time.
Which is why our mission for today's deep dive into our source material is so fascinating. We are looking at the role of Turkey as the gatekeeper of the Black Sea during the Ukraine-Russia war.
Right, and we have two very different lenses for this.
Yeah, we have these two totally distinct angles provided by our texts. One is a strict, hard-nosed geopolitical analysis of structural leverage, maritime logistics, and naval treaties.
The secular side of things, yeah.
And the other is a theological examination of human depravity, divine providence, and how massive international crises actually reflect the spiritual condition of the human heart.
It is a stark contrast.
We are literally looking at how a physical choke point on a map intersects with eternal realities.
Before we really get going, though, I think it is helpful to give a quick heads up about where these sources are coming from.
Good idea.
The texts we are pulling from contain some highly charged political realities, naturally. But they also come with very specific theological frameworks. For instance, the theological author leans heavily on a dispensationalist view of the world.
Which means they mention things like a pre-tribulational rapture, specific prophetic timelines for national Israel, things like that.
Yeah, and the stirring of nations like Magog. Now, as hosts, we come at this from a Westminster covenantal framework.
So in a different setting, we could probably spend hours debating those specific eschatological timelines.
Oh, easily. But our goal today is not to argue with the author or to take political sides, left or right.
No, definitely not.
Our job is to impartially report the contents of these sources, to show you the logic they are using, and to convey the original ideas without endorsing every single theological claim.
We want to give you the clearest picture of how these authors connect the dots. Okay, let's unpack this. How in the world does a maritime treaty signed all the way back in 1936 intercept with the Reformed doctrine of total depravity to explain the current blockade of the Black Sea?
It is a wild connection to make, right?
Because on the surface, international maritime law and the internal corruption of the human soul seem like, well, entirely different categories of thought.
Completely unrelated.
But our sources argue they are intimately connected. So to begin to understand this, we need to establish what a gatekeeper actually is.
Right. The definition is key here.
The geopolitical source defines a gatekeeper not as an actor who dominates an entire system, but one who possesses structural influence. They stand at a critical point of access.
That concept of structural influence is so crucial. It means you do not have to be the biggest, wealthiest, or most heavily armed nation in the room.
You just need the keys.
Yeah, you just have to hold the keys to the door everyone else needs to walk through.
I think of it like a bouncer at a nightclub. The bouncer does not own the building. They do not pour the drinks at the bar. They do not choose the music playing inside.
But they stand at the front door.
Yeah, they check IDs. They decide who gets in, who stays out, and under what conditions someone is allowed to cross the threshold.
And in this scenario, Turkey controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles straits.
Which are these incredibly narrow strips of water.
Right, and they are the only way in or out of the Black Sea. That means Turkey controls the maritime threshold for Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia.
And that structural authority is not just an assumed role, like they just decided to be the boss one day. It is heavily formalized through the 1936 Montreux Convention.
The legal architecture of this treaty is fascinating because it is so incredibly specific.
It really is.
In peacetime, the convention allows commercial ships to pass freely. That is vital for global trade, moving grain, oil, and manufactured goods.
But warship presence is subjected to a very rigid mathematical formula.
Yeah, the goal in 1936 was to prevent the Black Sea from becoming a congested, militarized zone where empires could just park massive armadas.
The numbers they use are wild. I mean, Article 14 sets a maximum limit of 9 foreign warships and 15,000 tons in transit through the straits at any one time.
And then Article 18 goes further.
Right. Article 18 limits the aggregate tonnage that non-Black Sea nations can have in the basin to 30,000 tons and restricts their presence to a maximum of 21 days.
It is so specific.
I have to stop here because 15,000 tons sounds like a lot until you compare it to modern ships. A single modern U.S. Nimitz-class aircraft carrier weighs around 100,000 tons.
Oh, yeah, it dwarfs the limit.
So are we essentially talking about World War II-era rules trying to govern 21st century warfare?
That is a brilliant way to look at it. Yes, Montreux was written in an era of dreadnoughts and early cruisers.
Which changes everything.
It does. So today, those tonnage limits mean external powers simply cannot move major modern strike groups into the Black Sea. It forces the area to remain a somewhat localized theater.
And in wartime, the regulations become even more restrictive, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Articles 19, 20, and 21 give Turkey graduated authority depending on the specific circumstances of the conflict.
So it scales up.
Yeah. If Turkey is not an active belligerent in the war, Article 19 states that warships of the warring parties shall not pass through the straits.
Just a hard stop.
Pretty much. There are a few very narrow exceptions, like a ship returning to its registered home base, but the general rule is a hard stop.
And this is not just theoretical history. This is the exact authority Ankara invoked in February 2022, right after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right. They did not waste any time.
Turkey officially classified the situation as a war, which immediately activated these wartime provisions.
It allowed them to restrict the flow of naval combatants into the theater, essentially locking the front door to Russian reinforcements from the Mediterranean.
That legal mechanism is the secular side of the coin. It is a treaty written by diplomats in Switzerland almost a century ago.
But the theological source takes us in a completely different direction.
Yeah, straight to the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically Chapter 5 regarding providence.
The author points out that God, the great creator of all things, upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all creatures, actions, and things.
From this perspective, Turkey's leverage over the straits, and even the Montreux Convention itself, are classified as secondary causes.
Well, the primary cause is the eternal decree of God.
Precisely. Ankara might hold the physical keys to the Bosporus, but their decisions are subservient to the Lord of Hosts, who stills the noise of the seas.
It is a massive perspective shift.
But this raises a huge question.
Okay, what is it?
If God is the primary cause, directing all things from the greatest to the least, does that not render human diplomacy, treaties like Montreux, and Turkey's geopolitical maneuvering completely pointless?
I see where you were going with this.
I mean, why should anyone care about a 1936 treaty if the eternal decree is already set in stone? It feels like we are just actors reading lines from a script we didn't write.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source provides a robust defense against two major theological errors that help answer your question.
Okay, what are they?
Deism and fatalism. The author is very careful to distinguish the Reformed view of providence from both of those extremes.
Let's break those down. Deism is essentially the clockmaker theory, right?
Right. Deism imagines God as a distant clockmaker who wound up the universe at the beginning of time and then just walked away.
So he is not involved in the day-to-day.
Well, I should say, precisely. In that view, God leaves the world to run purely on secondary causes like physics, weather patterns, and international law. He does not intervene.
And what about fatalism?
Fatalism, on the other end of the spectrum, ignores human agency entirely. Fatalism suggests that our choices do not matter at all because the end result is rigidly predetermined regardless of what we do.
So if a ship is going to sink, it will sink whether you steer it away from the rocks or not.
Yeah, that is the fatalistic view.
So how does the Westminster view, and this author's application of it, avoid those traps?
Well, the Westminster Confession holds that God's providence ordains events to occur according to the nature of second causes.
According to the nature of second causes.
Okay. That means human choices, historical contexts, and diplomatic negotiations are the actual mechanisms through which providence unfolds. Human agency is real.
So Turkey's choices matter.
Very much so. Turkey bears historical and moral responsibility for its stewardship of the straits. When they invoke Article 19, that is a real choice with massive immediate consequences for the Ukraine-Russia war, the global economy, and the lives of millions.
So human choices actually matter within the framework of God's sovereignty. They are not an illusion.
Spot on. The tension between God's absolute sovereignty and genuine human responsibility is a hallmark of Orthodox theology.
It is a tough balance to strike.
It is, but the geopolitical leverage Ankara wields is absolutely real, but it is derived and bounded. It operates within the theater of God's providence.
Turkey is a real gatekeeper, making real choices, but they are operating inside a house they did not build.
That is a great way to summarize it.
That distinction bridges the conversation brilliantly from the external legal text of Montreux to the internal biblical text.
Because Montreux only goes so far.
Right. Montreux is a perfect mathematical formula for peace on paper. So why are there still ships sinking and missiles flying?
Because treaties regulate the movement of metal hulls, they do not regulate the human heart.
Exactly. We are moving from the geopolitical symptoms of the conflict to the spiritual root causes.
And this is where the source turns to the book of James.
Specifically James chapter 4, verse 1, which asks a very blunt question. What causes quarrels and what causes wars among you?
The grammatical historical exegesis provided by the author is quite revealing here. Whenever you dig into the original Greek terms, you get a much sharper picture of the biblical diagnosis.
Let's look at the specific words.
The word James uses, translated as wars, is polemoi. In extra-biblical literature, like the ancient histories of Thucydides, polemos was not used to describe a brief skirmish or a minor border dispute.
It wasn't just a quick fight.
No, it was used to describe long-term, devastating military engagements that literally reshaped the ancient world.
We are talking about chronic, protracted, generational warfare.
Yes. And the author notes that this term appears 84 times in the New Testament, frequently associated with the eschatological birth pangs of the end times.
Wow, 84 times.
It perfectly describes the grinding, bloody attrition we see in Eastern Europe today. It is not a quick disagreement. It is a systemic dismantling of nations.
And James identifies the source of these polemoi. Notice what he does not say.
Right, he doesn't point to external factors.
He does not blame a failure in diplomatic negotiations. He does not point to a lack of structural leverage or a flaw in maritime law or a misunderstanding over trade routes.
He traces the origin directly to the hedonin, the passions or lusts.
The source points out that this Greek word is where we get the English word hedonism.
Yeah, these are the unmortified, sinful desires that demand satisfaction, even if it costs the neighbor their life, their land, or their security.
It is a dark reality.
And what is fascinating here is the syntax of the passage. The Greek verb indicates these passions are not dormant.
They are not just sitting quietly in the background waiting to be triggered.
No, the text says they are actively soldiering within the human heart. The internal lusts are waging a military campaign inside the soul long before the first tank crosses a border or the first ship is blocked at a strait.
It makes me think of an analogy. Trying to treat the Black Sea conflict strictly through the lens of political science, or trying to solve it purely with better trade agreements, is like trying to treat a severe systemic bacterial infection by just putting a topical Band-Aid over a rash.
That is a brilliant comparison.
You might cover up the visible symptom for a moment, you might make the skin look a little better, but the infection is still raging in the bloodstream.
The geopolitical crisis we are watching unfold on the global stage is essentially a macrocosm of the war that is already happening inside the unregenerate human heart.
And that exegesis is how the source anchors the Orthodox Reformed doctrine of total depravity.
Yes, the text is aggressively refuting liberal theology and secular philosophies of the modern era.
How so?
Well, many modern thinkers operate on the baseline assumption that man is inherently good and that war is just a tragic social maladjustment.
Like a glitch in the system.
Right. The secular view suggests that if we just establish better education, more equitable trade relations, or more robust international institutions like the United Nations or NATO, we can eventually cure the human inclination toward violence.
It is the idea that human nature is basically a blank slate, and bad environments create bad behavior. Fix the environment, fix the human.
Precisely. But the biblical text diagnoses the problem as a fundamental rebellion against the law of God.
And total depravity does not mean every human is as evil as they could possibly be at every moment, right?
No. It means that every faculty of the human person, the mind, the will, the emotions, is tainted by sin.
So the covetousness that leads a nation to invade its neighbor cannot be legislated out of existence by the Montreux Convention.
You cannot cure an internal spiritual disease with an external maritime treaty.
So, to you listening right now, consider this connection. How often do you blame external circumstances for conflicts that actually originate from your own internal desires?
It is a tough question to face.
Maybe it is your job, your family dynamics, the current economy, or the hostile political climate. How often do we point to the lack of a treaty in our interpersonal relationships, like a failure to communicate or a misunderstanding of boundaries, when the actual root cause is our own demand to have our passions satisfied?
We want what we want, and we wage war to get it.
Exactly. The macro-level wars among massive nations are just the scaled-up, heavily armed version of the micro-level wars happening in our own lives every single day.
That brings us to a devastating consequence of those internal passions: the weaponization of trade.
This is where things get really grim.
Yeah, when the lust for control expands, it doesn't just target military assets. We are shifting focus now from the movement of gray-hulled warships to the commercial survival of entire nations.
We are seeing how this conflict directly impacts global food supplies.
The logistics of this are absolutely staggering.
They really are. The geopolitical source details the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey in July 2022.
And this was an incredibly complex agreement.
It was designed to allow for the safe passage of commercial ships from 3 specific Ukrainian ports: Odessa, Kornomorsk, and Yuzhny.
Under this agreement, almost 33 million metric tons of grain and other foodstuffs were shipped out to global markets.
Try to visualize 33 million metric tons. We are talking about over 1,000 massive bulk carrier ships navigating through a declared war zone,
Dealing with insurance premiums that were through the roof.
just to get wheat and corn out to the rest of the world.
And the human element here cannot be overstated.
This was not just a matter of keeping European bakeries stocked. 65% of the wheat exported through this initiative went to developing countries.
That is a massive percentage.
The World Food Program moved huge quantities of this grain to places that were already on the brink of famine, places like Afghanistan, Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, and Ethiopia.
We're talking about literal daily bread for millions of people living on the extreme edge of starvation.
But the fragility of that system was exposed dramatically in July 2023 when the initiative collapsed after Russia withdrew its participation.
The disruption sent a massive shockwave through global freight markets. The geopolitical text notes that this closure contributed to a severe oversupply of smaller bulk vessels in the Mediterranean.
Let's pause and explain the mechanics of that. Why would a war in the Black Sea cause a pileup of ships in the Mediterranean?
It is a domino effect.
How so?
When the Black Sea ports closed, all those mid-sized bulk carriers that usually run the grain roads suddenly had nowhere to go.
They were just locked out.
Right, they could not get into the Black Sea, so they ended up dropping anchor in the Mediterranean looking for alternative cargo.
Which messes up the local markets.
Yes, this oversupply of ships drove down local shipping rates for a short time, while simultaneously spiking global price uncertainty for the actual commodities.
It proves that a conflict like this cannot be contained to regional waters.
Not at all. It ripples out, distorting shipping rates, blowing up insurance calculations, and threatening the economic stability of nations thousands of miles away from the actual fighting.
The theological source applies a very specific concept to this exact scenario.
Yeah.
The law-gospel distinction.
Specifically, it brings up the pedagogical use of the law.
That is a term that needs a bit of unpacking.
It does.
Think of the pedagogical use of the law like a mirror. The law of God does not fix the dirt on your face. A mirror cannot wash you. It just shows you exactly how dirty you are.
That is a solid way to explain it.
The author argues that the intentional withholding of daily bread by blockading these ports functions as a massive, highly visible exposure of systemic sin.
Because the law commands us to love our neighbor.
Right. And weaponizing the global food supply to gain political leverage over an opponent is a severe, undeniable violation of that command.
It is the mirror showing the dirt.
It exposes the sheer covetousness of nations in a way that no one can ignore or write off as just standard political maneuvering.
So we have two totally different views looking at the exact same trade disruption.
The geopolitical text analyzes the grain blockade as a point of leverage, a vulnerability in the supply chain that can be exploited for tactical gain.
While the theological text looks at the exact same data, the 33 million tons, the blocked ports, and sees a spiritual mirror reflecting human depravity on a global scale.
It makes me wonder how these authors view our modern reliance on these systems.
What do you mean?
How do these events challenge the modern prosperity gospel? Because we usually think of the prosperity gospel as a TV preacher promising you a private jet. But this seems like something broader.
Oh, it is much broader. The theological text offers a very sharp critique of modern pragmatism.
Okay, let's look into that.
In the modern era, particularly in the affluent West, there is a pervasive, unspoken assumption that perfect security can be found in well-managed supply chains, full grain silos, and robust international trade agreements.
Like, we can just engineer our way out of danger.
Precisely. The author frames this as a form of idolatry, a geopolitical prosperity gospel. It is the false promise that material safety can be permanently secured through human effort, logistical efficiency, and technological progress.
We trust the shipping containers more than we trust Providence.
Yes, we believe that if we just optimize the supply chain enough, we can eliminate the threat of scarcity.
But when the grain corridor collapses, when the ships are trapped in port, that idol shatters.
The crisis exposes the illusion of national self-sufficiency.
The text mentions that this terrifying scarcity should actually cultivate a deeper reliance on the means of grace.
Yes, and this is where the law-gospel distinction reaches its conclusion.
How does it resolve?
When earthly bread is withheld by the decrees of men, it exposes our vulnerability. That is the law doing its pedagogical work. But it then points the believer toward Christ as the true bread of life.
It is a massive contrast.
It really is. The world attempts to find peace and security through economic leverage and threat matrices. But the believer is called to recognize the reality that man shall not live by bread alone.
The disruption of international trade is utilized pedagogically to strip away our reliance on temporal, fragile systems and force a dependence on the eternal provision found only in the gospel.
Beautifully put.
Okay, so the front door of the Black Sea is heavily regulated by Turkey. The bouncers at the door checking tonnages, naval ships are restricted, grain shipments are leveraged and blocked.
But conflict, much like water, always finds a way.
When the front door is locked, the conflict doesn't just stop. It finds a way through the windows, down the chimney, or through the floorboards.
The battlefield does not just disappear, it expands into new domains.
The geopolitical source details a severe technological escalation by late 2025. Because traditional naval access was so heavily restricted by the Montreux Convention, sheer innovation took over.
We see the deployment of radically upgraded Ukrainian Sea Baby drones.
The specifications listed in the text are remarkable. They upgraded the operational range of these drones to 1,500 kilometers and increased the payload capacity to 2,000 kilograms of explosives.
Let's put that in perspective. How do these things actually work? Because we hear drone, and we think of a little plastic quadcopter taking wedding photos.
Right, something buzzing around a park.
Exactly. But these are uncrewed surface vessels. Imagine a sleek, low-profile speedboat packed with the explosive equivalent of a massive aerial bomb.
And they sit so low in the water.
Right, they sit so low that traditional ship-based radar has an incredibly difficult time detecting it until it is too late.
Because they do not have a human crew, they can be sent on one-way suicide missions across the entire length of the Black Sea.
A 2,000-kilogram payload hitting a ship at the waterline is going to cause catastrophic damage. It is an asymmetric nightmare for a traditional navy.
And the targets expanded right along with the technology. The conflict moved way beyond just sinking enemy warships.
Where else did it go?
These drones, along with other advanced tech, began threatening submarine communications cables, civilian port facilities, and offshore gas operations.
The European Union even proposed creating a Black Sea maritime security hub to deal with hybrid threats ranging all the way from satellite interference in space down to sabotage on the seabed.
The whole concept of a maritime theater got infinitely more complicated. It's no longer just ships shooting at ships.
Alongside the technological escalation, there was massive economic evasion. The geopolitical text dives into the concept of the shadow fleet.
By July 2025, the EU had listed 444 vessels as part of the shadow fleet.
Which begs the question, how do you hide a 900-foot-long oil tanker?
It sounds impossible, but the mechanics of it are wild.
Tell me about it.
These are commercial-looking tankers, but they operate with completely obscured ownership structures. They use shell companies registered in obscure jurisdictions.
And the insurance policies.
They sail with questionable insurance policies from unverified providers. They routinely engage in flag hopping, changing the country they're registered to whenever they face scrutiny.
They even turn off their automatic identification systems, their AIS transponders, so they go dark on tracking maps.
Yes, and they will meet other ships in the middle of the ocean at night to do ship-to-ship transfers of oil, mixing Russian oil with other supplies to mask its origin.
They are specifically designed to bypass Western sanctions on Russian energy exports. This completely blurs the line between civilian commerce and wartime logistics.
The Gatekeeper, Turkey, now has to monitor not just military gray hulls trying to sneak through the straits, but a massive fleet of ostensibly civilian ships carrying contested energy resources that fund the war machine.
And then, on top of the drones and the shadow fleets, you have the physical, unguided hazards left behind in the water.
We are talking about drifting sea mines.
Right. These are explosive devices that have broken loose from their moorings and are just floating blindly through the shipping lanes.
To deal with this, Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria formed a mine countermeasures task group in January 2024.
The geopolitical text notes they neutralized approximately 150 sea mines over a 4-year period.
And during that same time, over 12,000 commercial ships transited the basin.
Neutralizing 150 mines might not sound like a huge number, but all it takes is one striking a commercial grain ship to cause an international incident, spike insurance rates to unaffordable levels, and shut down the trade routes all over again.
This brings to mind an analogy. It is like trying to secure a bank vault while the floor you are standing on is actively crumbling.
That is a great visual.
Turkey is checking IDs at the door, but the foundation of the room is filled with drifting explosives. Which leads me to a major pushback on Turkey's actions as the gatekeeper.
Okay, what is the pushback?
In January 2024, the United Kingdom donated 2 specialized mine hunter ships to Ukraine to help clear these hazards.
And these are highly specialized vessels. They're usually built with fiberglass or wooden hulls, so they do not trigger magnetic mines.
They use advanced sonar to map the seabed and deploy remote submersibles to blow up the mine safely.
Right, they are essentially floating bomb squads.
Clearing mines objectively helps everyone. It protects civilian grain ships, it reduces those skyrocketing insurance premiums, and it stabilizes the region for international trade.
That makes perfect sense.
Yet, Turkey blocked those 2 British mine hunters from passing through the straits, citing the Montreux Convention.
I see where the friction is.
I have to ask, why would a gatekeeper block ships that are literally designed to clean up the mess? It seems entirely counterproductive.
It does seem completely irrational until you look at the inherent logic of a gatekeeper.
Walk me through that logic.
From a tactical, localized perspective, clearing mines is an immediate good. Everyone wants safe waters. But Turkey prioritized the preservation of a bounded legal order over the immediate tactical benefit for Ukraine.
The geopolitical text explains that Ankara desperately wanted to avoid a scenario where the Black Sea became a heavily internationalized NATO theater.
It is the ultimate slippery slope argument.
If you let one in, you have to let them all in.
Precisely. If Turkey grants a special exception for British mine hunters today because they're doing a good deed, what is the exception tomorrow? Is it a destroyer to escort the mine hunters?
And then a cruiser to provide air defense for the destroyer.
Yes. Once the precedent of bypassing the strict wartime restrictions of Montreux is set, the entire legal framework loses its authority.
So Turkey's decision was a deeply conservative move aimed at preventing horizontal escalation.
They believed that maintaining absolute, rigid adherence to the text of the treaty, even when it frustrated their own NATO allies, was the only way to keep the conflict from spiraling into a wider, unconstrained naval war involving external superpowers.
A gatekeeper's authority relies entirely on the perception that the rules are enforced impartially.
The moment you start making subjective exceptions, you are no longer a neutral bouncer. You are an active participant in the fight.
Which brings us to the immense burden of balancing all these competing interests. Being a human gatekeeper in a fallen world is an impossible tightrope walk. You are damned if you do and damned if you don't.
The constraints on Ankara are immense, and they are pulling the country in completely opposite directions.
Wow.
On one hand, as a NATO member, Turkey supports Ukrainian sovereignty. They provide political support on the global stage, and they have sold highly effective defense equipment, like the Bayraktar drones, directly to Kyiv.
At the same time, their economy is deeply intertwined with Russia.
The text mentions Turkey pursuing major liquefied natural gas deals with companies like ExxonMobil. They are actively trying to reduce their reliance on Russian energy infrastructure.
Yet, despite those diversification efforts, Turkey still officially opposes Western sanctions against Moscow.
They maintain open channels of communication, they welcome Russian tourists, and they facilitate significant trade with Russia.
They are trying to balance the ideological defense of international borders with the brutal reality of their own economic survival and their geographical proximity to a massive, aggressive military power.
If they lean too far toward Ukraine in the West, they risk direct retaliation and catastrophic economic ruin from Russia.
But if they lean too far toward Russia, they alienate their NATO allies, face potential secondary sanctions, and lose their credibility as an impartial administrator of the straits.
This geopolitical balancing act perfectly illustrates the theological author's perspective on the vanity of trusting earthly mediators.
No human government, no matter how skilled its diplomats are, can offer perfect justice or permanent security.
Human institutions are always constrained by their own survival instincts, their economic vulnerabilities, and their compromise alliances.
The theological text looks at this geopolitical tightrope and concludes that placing our ultimate hope in these structures is an exercise in futility.
Now, as we mentioned in the very beginning, the author of the theological text uses a specific dispensationalist framework to interpret these events.
Right. When they look at the shifting alliances in the Black Sea, they refer to the stirring of Magog in the north.
They look toward a pre-tribulational rapture and a literal premillennial reign of Christ on earth.
They view these current events through a very specific prophetic lens regarding the end times and the future of national Israel.
While our own Westminster-based views understand redemptive history differently, focusing on the church as the culmination of God's covenantal promises, we can clearly observe how the author's framework heightens their sense of urgency.
For them, these geopolitical tremors are direct countdown markers. But regardless of the specific eschatological timeline, both frameworks agree on the temporary fragile nature of national borders and human treaties.
What's fascinating here is how the source brings all of this massive geopolitical data and heavy theological analysis to a singular resolution.
Where does it point?
The text points away from the straits and points to Jesus Christ as the true gatekeeper, drawing from Revelation chapter 3, verse 7, which speaks of the one who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens.
And John chapter 10, verse 9, where Jesus says, I am the door.
The author draws a razor-sharp contrast. Earthly gatekeepers, like Turkey, rely on highly conditional influence.
Their authority is based on shifting alliances, temporary treaties from 1936, and their ability to desperately balance competing threats.
They can only regulate the physical passage of ships made of steel. And as we saw with the drones and the shadow fleets, they cannot even do that perfectly. The conflict always finds a way around them.
But Christ holds the keys of death and Hades.
He alone possesses absolute unconditional authority. The theological text argues that while the world looks to human diplomacy for a temporary pause in hostilities, a ceasefire, a new grain deal, a modified treaty, Christ offers an eternal peace that no political maneuvering can achieve.
An earthly gatekeeper can close the Bosporus to a naval fleet, but only the true gatekeeper can open the way to the Father.
The resolution to the gatekeeper problem is not found in a better iteration of international law or a more robust UN charter, but in the finished work of Christ.
He transcends every physical blockade and secures a peace that the political world cannot engineer. We've covered incredible ground today.
We really have.
We moved from the rigid mathematical tonnages of the Montreux Convention to the unmortified, soldiering passions of the human heart in James 4.
We looked at the tragic weaponization of grain shipments and the technological leap of 1,500-kilometer naval drones.
All the way to the theological realities of providence, the mirror of the law, and the limits of earthly mediation. As we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over in your own life.
A final takeaway.
We have spent this whole time analyzing how controlling a physical choke point on a map, a narrow strait of water no wider than a river in some places, grants immense leverage over the economies and security of entire nations. The one who controls the gate shapes the reality of the entire system. In your own life, what are the invisible straits or choke points? Perhaps it is your attention. Perhaps it is your digital habits, your daily media consumption, or the algorithms dictating your news feed. Have you unknowingly handed control of those vital corridors over to outside gatekeepers?
That is a piercing question.
Are there cultural narratives or technological platforms that dictate what enters your mind and what gets blocked out? If the conflict in the Black Sea teaches us anything, it is that whoever regulates the threshold controls the environment. So who actually holds the keys to the information that shapes your soul? Are you actively guarding that gate, or is it wide open to the highest bidder?
That is something we all need to evaluate.
Thank you for joining us today for this analysis. We love taking these complex texts and finding the connections that matter to the big picture and to our everyday lives.
It has been a pleasure walking through this material with you. Keep questioning assumptions, keep analyzing the mechanics behind the headlines, and keep seeking the truth.
Until next time, Remember that the diagnostic landscape of our world might be muddy, but the root causes are older than any treaty. See you next time.